quilt shop, and today I would like to help you master your perfect seam. I hate calling it a scant quarter, quarter inch, whatever, because it's whatever you have to sew to make sure that your blocks fit together properly. You can see with a quilt like this, every block is identical in the quilt. So long as you had a consistent seam allowance, even if it's not quite the right size, everything would fit together. At the end of your project, it might be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller than somebody else's, but everything fits together. It's when we start making quilts that have multiple seams, different blocks with a different amount of seams in them, when we start sewing them together, even if we're out just a couple threads, they won't fit, and you will be struggling trying to match points or even just getting blocks fitting at the same size. So what we want to do is always test your seam. When I have a new sewing machine, when I haven't sewn for quite a while, or even when I started doing this, because there was so many seams in it, I even retested myself just to make sure that I'm spot on. So this is what we're going to do. There are three things that factor into your quarter-inch seam: how you cut, how you sew, and how you press. Because everybody sits and sees differently, you do need to set up your machine for yourself. Today, I'm going to show you my technique to accomplish this. So what we need is 3 pieces of fabric. I want to make sure I cut them exactly 1.5 by 3.5. You can see when I do my cutting, my line of my ruler is just on top of my fabric. I don't want it beside. I want it on top just to give me that extra thread that will be taken up in the seam allowance. So I have my 3 pieces that are cut, and now I'm going to sew them together. Okay, so I have a couple different feet here that I wanted to show you. This is our standard quarter-inch foot with a flange. You can see that you run your fabric up against the flange, but you have to be careful not to squish your fabric too far so it bends. And also, if your foot gets old, this flange can start getting weak and it can actually move a little bit. My favorite that came with my Pfaff is this quarter-inch foot right here. You can see from the center of my needle to the edge of my foot is exactly a quarter-inch. Now, if you don't have a quarter-inch foot, you can use your standard foot as long as your sewing machine can move your needle to the right, or we can mark the bed of our sewing machine. So I'm going to install my quarter-inch foot on my sewing machine and get ready to sew. So we're going to take our 2 pieces of fabric. I'm going to make sure that those edges are lined up perfectly. And I am going to sew what I think is a quarter-inch seam. Now I'm going to press my seam to the side. So I'm going to set my seam, and what that does is help embed my thread into my fabric. I'm going to open it with my fingers. I want to make sure that that seam is wide open. I don't want to stretch it so I can see my thread, but I want to make sure that there's no foldy over parts. And now I am going to sew my other piece to the other side. Again, setting my seam, opening it up, and there we have it. So now that we have it sewn, we're going to measure and see how accurate we were. Because we cut our strip at 1.5 and we've got a quarter-inch seam allowance and a quarter-inch seam allowance, this whole center strip should measure exactly 1 inch. The whole unit will measure 3.5. So you can see if I put my lines on the edge of my block, my 3.5 inch, I should have no fabric there and no fabric there. So if we measure our sample and we find that our center strip is too large, that will mean that our seam allowance is too small. So you can see with this foot, if I was sewing and my needle was on that sewing line, my fabric wasn't anywhere near the edge of my foot. So I would either move my fabric to the right, or if it was already in the right, we would have to move our needle a little bit to the left. If our fabric was too small, you can see that our seam was too big. We would have to unpick this one. But this one, you can see that if our fabric was right against our flange and our seam is too big, we would have to definitely move our needle to the right. Or make sure that our fabric is not smooshed up against our flange and move it over just a hair's width. So what could you do if you don't have a 1/4 inch foot? Let's just use our regular all-purpose presser foot. I'm just going to put some paper under there so hopefully you can see a little bit better. I'm going to take a ruler and I'm going to align it with the edge of my presser foot as if it was my fabric. And then I am going to take my needle and move it to the right until it is in the position that you need. I'm going to take my foot off, I'm holding my ruler tight. I'm just going to take it off so you can see a little bit better. So you can see that my needle is actually a little bit too far. I want it to be just saying it's to the right of my 1/4 inch line on my ruler. If you can't move your needle, I'm just going to put this back into the center position. There's a couple neat tools that we can use to help do that. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my ruler. Let's just put that paper back under to hopefully you can see. But this time, I am going to align my ruler, not with the edge of my foot, but with my 1/4 inch seam. Or that's where my needle is touching my 1/4 inch seam. There's a couple different tools that we have. You can see Clover made this seam guide, which is just a little bit of a stickiness that can be taken on and off, and you can place that. Or there's also these sewing edges, and they're reusable vinyl stops. I'm just going to take one of these. I even cut them in half because we don't usually need them quite that long. But you're going to take the sticky off the back. You are going to align it exactly with the edge of your ruler. I'll now lift my foot, lift my needle, and then as I sew with my fabric, you can see my fabric. I am just going to line it up against my guide, and then I will sew. So what you're going to have to do, again, that very same test that we did before, I have yet to put it on there exactly right the first time. We usually have to move it. So all I'm doing is I'm just letting my fabric run right next to the edge of the sticky. You can see that there's an actual lip, so it holds it quite nicely. Alrighty, so I'm going to lay this down and I'm going to measure. So you can see right there that there's not, there's just a little gap. So my seam is actually a little bit too big. So what I'm going to do is I am going to move my tape a little bit to the left, just a smidge. Okay, so I'm going to want to move my tape a little bit to the left. So what I'm going to do is, again, take my ruler, just move it over that ever so slightly that way. I'm going to hold it in place. And again, I'm going to butt this up against my ruler. Like that. And you would have to sew another one and continue sewing until they're absolutely perfect. One thing that I never did mention is if you measure your strip and it was exactly perfect at the top, but maybe it was off at the bottom, that just means that your control on your strip was not straight all the way through. Make sure that when you're sewing your pieces together, no matter what kind of pieces you're doing, you are going to hold your strip. Don't let it slide through your fingers. Align it all the way up. When you get to where your finger can't go under the foot, make sure your finger is beside it and hold it exactly where you want it to be so you can follow along. Okay, so once you have your seam set up and you think you're good and you want to try to perfect it, again, it's just practice. What's a really neat project to do, maybe a table runner or placemats of some kind of block that has pieces that go around a center. So you can see that this is the beginning of a log cabin. It could be maybe a 4-patch or 9-patch with a border, and cut your pieces all to the exact size. When you go to put your next piece on, so you can see the next piece that I'm going to put here was supposed to be 3.5 inches. If I lay my 3.5 inch piece on my block, and I can see that my block is larger than my strip, that means my block is not sewn correctly. I am going to take it at that point and I'm going to re-sew my seam. If you continue doing that on every strip, number one, you get practice, but number two, you're going to get an absolutely perfectly sized block. If you took this block now and if we just squared it up to 3.5, some of my strips would be too small. If it was anything with points, you would lose them. So that's why it's imperative to get that 1/4 inch seam. So I hope this helped you today and will get us on the road to becoming better quilters. So happy sewing, and we'll see you again.